Wow, how do you live up to that introduction? Thank you so much, Max. It's great to be here today. Before I begin, I would love to just thank the folks at the Library of Congress for letting me be a part of this wonderful event. So I'm sure everyone here in this tent would agree with me when I say that the Vietnam War figures largely in the American memory. Although this year marks what President Obama has declared as the 50th anniversary of the start of that war, it doesn't seem like the conflict began a half century ago. Rather, the war seems very recent, kept alive by constant references. Whether a result of Hollywood films, such as the ones that Max listed, or more frequently, national headlines alluding to comparisons with the current war in Afghanistan. Indeed, my very own New York Times op-ed that it's entitled Exploding the Myths about Vietnam, which appeared last month, and I'm sorry, it's a shameless plug for an article I wrote. The Vietnam War still feels very present. This isn't surprising. The war, which is arguably still America's longest war, shook the foundations of US society. It reached into nearly every American home through military service, through participation in protest movements, and even through television sets as everyday citizens and their leaders debated the merits of US intervention in this far-off place in Southeast Asia. By the war's end, over 56,000 American lives were lost and the nation nearly torn asunder. No wonder why it doesn't seem like ancient history. For me, as a Vietnamese American, this feeling that the Vietnam War had just transpired is even more palpable. Although my parents, who are here today, rarely talked about our lives in Vietnam. And here I can just imagine my mom saying, the past is in the past. Why bring up sad memories? While my father would admonish me, just focus on the present and get your homework done. I was, though, finally able to piece together what had happened to my family in 1975. In fact, and I know that this will make my parents sound like stereotypical working class immigrants, but they only shared their story with me, the story of how we made it in 1975 to the United States, when I told them that it was for a class assignment. So, yeah, so in one fell swoop, the past was finally in the present, and I got my homework done. So what I learned was that when I was 5 months old, as Max said, my family, and you have to understand family in the Vietnamese context doesn't just mean nuclear family. My family, including my mom and dad, my maternal aunt and grandmother, my 8 elder brothers and sisters, my paternal uncles and cousins, just barely escaped Saigon in 1975. Our escape was a harrowing one, full of twists and turns and happenstance. We could have easily have been stuck back in Vietnam rather than have escaped to America. So on that day, and it was April 29th, 1975, as Irving Berlin's White Christmas played out again and again on the American radio station, this, for those of you who don't know, this was the signal for US personnel to move to their evacuation points in the city. My father, who had served in the South Vietnamese Army, understood that it was time that we too prepared to leave our home country. For months, he and his kin had planned possible escape routes and finally decided on one. His cousin, who was an Air Force pilot, had access to a helicopter that could carry everyone to safety. He and my dad decided that on the day of the escape, he would fly the helicopter above our house in the city, which would indicate to my dad to round up the family members and get everyone to the nearby high school in Nguyen. So on that chaotic morning of April 29th, when many Saigonese were scrambling in the streets as the imminent collapse of their government was near, my dad drove his pilot cousin to Tân Sơn Nhất Air Base, which basically had suffered heavy shelling and bombing throughout the night from communist forces. When they got there, they were actually denied entry. While my dad returned home, his cousin attempted entry again by himself and fortunately was eventually successful. When my dad heard the whomp, whomp, whomp of the helicopter blades above his house, despite some militia firing at the chopper, he knew it was time to go. One snag, though. My mom didn't want to leave her native land. You have to understand, back then, nothing was clear. I mean, in her head, she thought, even if you could escape the city, where were we going to go? So with no solid plans in sight, My mom turned to my dad and just said, basically, take the sons and go, flee. Her immediate fear was that the new regime would conscript her young sons into the military, not that of a family that could be indefinitely divided. She didn't even think that that could be a prospect. Unable to convince her to leave, my dad turned to my eldest brother, who was a wee 16 years old at the time, who had the ingenious plan to bring my maternal grandmother into the equation. He was always the smartest one, that one. It makes sense. He eventually went on to get his PhD in nuclear physics here in the United States. But back to the story. My grandmother. So my grandmother, she was, you could describe, she was an adventurous spirit. She had fled her home village in central Vietnam when she was 19 years old in the late 1920s. She did this because she didn't want to be married off to an older gentleman. Instead, what she did was she set her sights on Saigon, which back then was a beautiful city which the French colonialists had made their own. My grandmother then raised her family in the city and watched as the Paris of the Orient transformed into an American town with the advent of US troops. Eager to explore new lands once again, my grandmother did not need any convincing to leave in 1975. And as dutiful daughters, my mother and her sister, who is also here today, had no choice then but to follow their mom. Once my parents decided that the whole family had to escape, the next step was to gather all of their children and belongings and locate a safe passage out. This was no easy task since, especially as you may recall, I said I had 8 elder brothers and sisters. Moreover, our first attempt failed. After waiting 2 hours at the agreed-upon rendezvous site, the local high school in Nguyen, the helicopter never showed. My dad found out later, when we were all safe in the United States, that his cousin had actually ran out of fuel and had to return to the Tân Sơn Nhất Air Base. At this point, my paternal uncle set out to find another means of escape, while the rest of us returned home to await word. Our second, and fortunately successful, attempt at fleeing came not by air, but by sea. When my uncle phoned us with the good news that he had secured a space on a cargo boat that was docked down by the Saigon riverfront, we immediately prepared to leave once again. But just as we were about to set out, one of my brothers, who was 10 years old at the time, went out to play with his cousins without telling a single adult where he was going, where they were going. Fortunately, he didn't allow his younger brother, who's also here, seated in the audience today, to tag along. So what I can only gather was at the proverbial last minute, we found my brother in the nick of time and we were able to proceed down to the Saigon River. By the time we made it down to the riverfront, the cargo boat that could perhaps, say, carry about a dozen people on a good day was jam-packed. Fortunately, there was still room enough for our large group. The story doesn't end there, though. Although we were safely on the boat, albeit huddled very closely together, it didn't leave immediately. My dad figured this gave him enough time to possibly locate more relatives and help them flee. His first, and what would be his only stop, was to my maternal aunt's home, where he found my mother's sister taking care of her 4 children, including an infant son. Although she wanted to leave, she couldn't, since her husband was not with them. My dad couldn't convince her to go, and it would be nearly 20 years until we saw them again in the United States. We found out through their letters that her husband, who had served also in the South Vietnamese Army, was sent to re-education camp for several years after the war. Upon leaving my aunt's home with a heavy heart, the sound of gunfire nearby brought my dad back to the moment. He realized at that point that he had to abandon his plans to locate more relatives. The Saigon streets had become too dangerous. Upon returning to the riverfront, however, he was aghast to find that the boat, which had carried all that he had loved, had crossed to the other side of the river. His heart sank. It would take, basically on a good day, a half a day's drive to reach the other side of the river, never mind that he would have to dodge bullets on the way, and the boat could set out at any time. Spying a dinghy at the last minute, he eventually managed to get across the river. Our boat then left Saigon at night on April 29th, and by mid-morning the next day, we made our way to several miles offshore Vũng Tàu, a coastal city about 80 miles south of Saigon. There, the boat's captain told us he would go no further and actually ordered all passengers to disembark onto an abandoned U.S. ammunition barge. Can you imagine?